Well, there's this one area, and I don't go there very much, but I call it the kill zone. There are just 50, 60 skeletons of dead animals from fresh to years old, all in this one area. It's very strange. I was spending a night with my grandparents, and at that time it was in North Texas. They had several acres of woods behind the house, and we were pulling into the carport, but it was an older house, and it was really tight, so my grandfather would always make me get out of the car in the driveway. And I got out, and it was dark, and he had a retaining wall at one end of his driveway, and I saw something over there move around, and I thought it was just a big black dog. So I started walking over there towards it. And as I got closer, I thought for a split second maybe it was some kind of giant bird, because it looked like it had wings with feathers hanging down. And it was down on all fours, crouched down, trying to stay in the shadows behind this retaining wall. And I got right up to the edge of it and looked down there, and and it looked at me, and first I thought it was wrinkling its lips, because we had a dog and it was always growling and wrinkling its lips at me. But then I realized, and this is all happening very fast, that it was smiling at me. And with these, my dad played the piano, and the best way I can describe it is that the teeth look like the yellow keys on the piano. And I mean, this thing was smiling at me, and it was so human in the face that it was just, it wasn't computing with me. And then it raised up one of his hands and motioned me to come over there, just like this. And I had been kind of frozen looking at this thing, but when it did that, I screamed and started running in, and my grandfather had already gone in the house, and I told him that there was a big hairy man over there. And he looked concerned, grabbed his 12 gauge, ran out there, and I heard a shot go off, and he came back in and said he didn't see anything. So that was kind of my first experience with this animal.
David's Sasquatch encounter fundamentally shaped his life from an early age and sparked what would become a lifelong obsession. He's not out searching for Bigfoot with a camera crew or looking for fame. He's driven by personal curiosity and a desire to unravel the mystery, as many have before him. After that night at his grandparents', he tried to forget the encounter, but he couldn't let it go. Life moved on, and as David got older, he wrote it off as a childhood fantasy. But a few years later, something happened that brought those memories flooding back and reignited the flame of that lifelong obsession. Texas has hundreds of reported Sasquatch encounters and is widely regarded as one of the United States' biggest Bigfoot hotspots. From the dense piney woods of the east to central and southern woodlands and river bottoms, sightings span generations and are often overlooked or dismissed. In this documentary, we'll track these stories, meet the people behind them, and uncover the hidden history of Bigfoot sightings that continue to fuel David's search for the Sasquatch of the South.
I tried to forget about it, put it out of my mind. And I was at Camp Grady Spruce in July of 1969, and they would do these Brazos River trips. And we were on one of those, and we camped at a place right near a place called Chick Bend, which is right near Kyle Mountain. I think there's a Boy Scout camp there, and there's a couple of reports from that Boy Scout camp. As it was getting dark, and there was probably 18 campers and 2 counselors, and there was this overhang, maybe a 30-foot cliff face right above where we were camping, and they kept seeing something up there looking at us. You know, one guy said it was a wolf, some guy said it was a bear, another guy said, no, it looks like a big monkey, and that was it. And then the next morning we were all packing up, and this was probably 9 o'clock in the morning, and the guy that I was in the tent with and in my canoe, he said that he had seen it up there again. And I said, well, what was it? He goes, it looked like some kind of a wolf. So there was a tree right by it, so we climbed up the tree and got up on top of this thing. And we could hear something running off. So we go tearing down this trail after it. I was in the lead, and I came around this rock outcrop, and I thought I slammed into this tree. It knocked me down, and I'm sitting there straddling this tree, and the tree was hairy, and I looked up, and there it was. I mean, I actually made physical contact with this thing. So I kind of did a crab walk backwards because I was on my back, and got up and I screamed, and then this thing roared. And just about this time, this friend of mine, he came running up, he saw it too, and we were so terrified that we jumped off of that cliff. And luckily we landed in some brush and just kind of got scraped up. But you know, the counselor and everybody down there had heard this roar and then heard us scream, and we told them there's a ape thing that's up there. And that was, you know, and we were pretty traumatized, but you know, we went back to camp, and you know, I tried to talk to some people about it, but you know, I remember the day very well because that day was the day they landed on the moon. And everybody was all hyped up about that, and they didn't want to hear about some monkey in the woods. So that kind of started my journey on this thing. You know, I started going down to the library and reading about this, and then I had seen, I can't remember the magazine, but I was down at the library. They had a magazine that had the 67 Patterson Gimlin. You know, and they were talking about it then and talking about the footprint. So I was like, okay. So, you know, there wasn't a lot of information on it then, but that's kind of where my journey started right there.
Physical interactions with Sasquatch are among the rarest reported encounters. Most witnesses only catch a brief glimpse. David's experience at Camp Grady Spruce was different. There were multiple witnesses, direct physical contact, and confused reactions from adults who didn't know how to explain what they heard. While the world focused on the moon landing, David was left trying to understand something much more exciting. The experience drove him to search for answers. He began digging through newspapers, books, and early reports, repeatedly finding references to the Brazos River. Stretching from North Texas to the Gulf of Mexico, the river forms a major wildlife corridor and was also the site of David's second encounter. As he researched, David realized he was not alone. Others had reported strange encounters along that same stretch of river long before him.
Well, once I started getting into this, I started going back to that place on the Brazos because I figured that would be a good place to start. And I did some research on that, and that area where this happened There's a legend that went back into the 1800s about the Brazos 8 men, and they even called Kyle Mountain, another name for it was 8 Mountain. And there was a very interesting story, you can look it up, it's called Hugo's Monster. And I'm guessing it's just a way a rural community would figure something out. And apparently the story goes, kind of like a Dr. Frankenstein. This doctor from overseas, I think it was maybe Germany or something, came over, and he had a laboratory in a cave up on Kyle Mountain. And they thought that he had something to do with creating these ape creatures. And as the story goes, kind of like in the Frankenstein, the town folk came up there with torches and blew the entrance to the cave shut. But probably the most scary story, and I had always thought the best way to see one of these creatures is to do whatever you can to make sure they do not know you're there. I had a kayak, and you could put it in about 3 miles down and actually paddle upstream, which was a little difficult because of the currents, but there was a cliff face, and I figured that they had lookouts, and there's a lot of canoe traffic that would go down the river, that they could see them coming. But if somebody was coming the other way and hiding this cliff face, they wouldn't see you. There's a cattle ranch on the other side of the river there, and I think there still is. And there are some reports from that cattle ranch that are online. I had read one of the reports, and they had had calves go missing and all this stuff. So I had this collar, and I could mimic the sound of a calf in distress. And I must have been doing a really good job, because one of the mama cows, you could tell she was getting very upset. And at that place, it was very low in the river, and the cattle could actually walk across the river. And she got so upset, she started coming across the river very angrily, so I quit. I didn't want her coming over there. It got dark, and we were sitting there in the dark, and probably within an hour, nothing had happened. And I told this gal, I said, I'm gonna do a Bigfoot scream, and let's, just see if anything happens. So I did one of these screams, and within seconds, let's just say we're at one place, and this was at 10 o'clock across the river. And at night, the cattle would come down by the river and sleep. This roar, and the only thing it sounded like a lion. The lung power was just unbelievable. So that kind of definitely freaked my girlfriend out, and probably within 5 or 10 seconds, it started mimicking a screech owl. And then there was 2 behind us, like at 7 and 3 o'clock, somewhere off in the woods behind where we were, and they would answer. So this was going on. So that was a little concerning. Then I would say within about 5 minutes, we heard the sound. It's the most horrible sound I've ever heard, of this calf just being absolutely, it sounded like it was being ripped apart. And it was over within 10 seconds. And I had a fire ready to go, so I'm like, the heck with this, start the fire. So we got a big fire going, and I had a parabolic dish, and I could hear the ones behind us creeping around. And we stayed up most of the night, and all through the night, this mama cow was calling for her calf. And this went on the rest of the night, and until we left, probably 9 o'clock the next morning. it was looking for this poor calf. But we were going to stay another night, but she wanted to get out of there as soon as possible. And I started thinking about, why were the two over there on our side of the river? And the only thing I could come up with that was plausible was, like I had mentioned, it was low enough where the cattle could get across the river. So I'm thinking that the one that was over there that actually killed the calf, if they spooked the cows and they ran across the river, the other two would be set up for an ambush. But at that point I decided maybe it's not a good idea to be someplace where they don't think you are, because the one that roared was obviously extremely upset that we were there. You could feel it. It was almost, I don't know, and I'm thinking maybe the ones behind us, there was some kind of infrasound thing going on from over there too. It was just so powerful. There's no way a human could even come close to the set of lungs that thing had.
David's time on the Brazos River didn't just confirm the old stories he had been reading about. It showed him that the legends of a half-man, half-ape creature in that area weren't just folklore. Between historical accounts, missing livestock, and the encounter he witnessed firsthand, he realized he was dealing with something intelligent. But his search didn't end on the Brazos. In the years that followed, David kept going back to the field, tracking the creature, revisiting locations, and paying attention to anything that might help him understand their behavior. Those efforts led to a long series of strange incidents across Texas, including one of his most unusual encounters. This one occurred in broad daylight, with only David and his pet wolf dog at his side.
I've had some interesting near misses. The last sighting I had was in December of 2018 outside of Austin. I was hiking with a wolf that I used to have, and she was pretty cool because she would always help me track these things. And one thing she used to do, and I had her for 13 years, she would just run off, a lot of times, and she'd be gone 10 or 15 minutes, and then she'd come back all happy. I think one of the younger ones, when we would go out there, would follow us. One of the teenagers, one of the teen foots, if you will. And I think that, it's just my personal opinion, but I think she struck up a little friendship. And whenever she knew he was around, she'd run over there, and I'm not sure what she's doing. A couple times she'd come back and she'd certainly have a, at first I thought maybe she'd been sprayed by a skunk, but it was different. So I don't know. She was definitely doing something, and I would run after her. And one time in particular, I could see where this thing ran across a creek. And when I got up there, water's still filling in these muddy prints. And then I find her, 5 or 10 minutes later, she comes back to me and she's excited. So I'm not sure. Either she was chasing him or hanging out with this one, I don't know, but whatever it was, she seemed to really enjoy doing it. One particular day, about 10 in the morning, she went over to this mound and started yelping and looking at me and yelping, and then this thing stood up and probably 20 feet away. And we sat there and kind of stared at each other for maybe 5 to 10 seconds. And then this thing made 3 of the most incredible, swift, silent moves I have ever seen an animal do, and was gone. But what was surprising about that is it was not the classic Bigfoot, the big, hairy, dark one. This thing was very tall, probably 7 feet, but very light brown hair, almost blonde on the chest, and you could see some of the chest through the hair. And it was very slim, like a basketball player. So, I think just like there's races of humans, there's races of these hairy men. And depending on where they are, so I'm guessing this is maybe something that's down in South America, Mexico, maybe into Texas. During the winter months, the bigger ones would migrate down there. I never saw any of those down there, but I would find their tracks, and they were a lot bigger than these, I called them the locals.
David's encounter in the Texas Hill Country added another layer to what he'd already learned over the years investigating Sasquatch. He began recognizing differences in sizes, shapes, and behaviors, and eventually he started noticing patterns. As he continued tracking them, David realized something else. There was evidence of younger individuals mixed in with the larger ones, signs of groups, families, and generations growing up in the same areas he'd visited for years. That realization shifted his focus from single encounters to long-term observation. And that's where his next story begins.
The big ones, their footprints are bigger and wider. And I find a lot of the footprints of this southern species, and they can be big too, but they seem to be a little narrower. And there's obviously some family groups, because I have pictures of footprints, I call them baby foots, maybe 4 inches. There's one particular infant, and I found a baby footprint probably 16 years ago. And they must still be out there. The younger ones are not as careful about leaving prints as the older ones. I've got footprints of that, and I think it's the same one, of him or her growing up. They're getting bigger and bigger, and there's just all kinds of stuff. And I kind of got to be friends with those over the years, and I wasn't using any technology on them, because I think these things are absolutely 100% hip to technology. You bring game cameras, anything out there, they're hip. So I didn't disrespect them. One particular time, I did put out one of my camera traps, and that seemed to really aggravate them. They wouldn't have anything to do with me for about 2 or 3 years. I think I've regained their trust. I'm still out there messing with them. But I leave them treats, and one of the most interesting things is they like peanut butter. So I would leave peanut butter jars out there at this one particular place. Now, I would take the lid off the peanut butter, date it, put it back on, and they would disappear. And I'm still finding them sometimes miles away. But the interesting thing is, and I've got a lot of pictures of this, is I guess they didn't want to mess with unscrewing the lid. They would grab these peanut butter jars and just twist them in half. Have you ever tried to do that? You could see where the fingers dug in, dented in the bottom of it, so they could get a grip of it. And
over time, David learned that these groups weren't isolated to the deep woods. Tracks, food habits, and even the disappearance of those peanut butter jars showed him that some of these creatures were operating much closer to people than most would assume. And as he followed their movements, he began noticing a different pattern. It suggested they were adapting. not just avoiding technology, not just traveling in family units, but moving through the edges of everyday life using cover, timing, and terrain to stay unseen. And eventually, that behavior led David to a realization many longtime researchers talk about, but few have witnessed firsthand. These things were only out in the thickets or river bottoms. They were coming into town.
There was a deep creek bed that goes through the town I live in, and they were coming up through the hills, and you could get to, and it's a small town, but they could go any place in town by using these ravines. And one of them came up right by my house, and there was used to be a vacant lot next door to where I lived, and they would come up through there and go through this wooded lot across the street from me. And I'm pretty sure what they were doing is getting food out of the at the elementary school, the cafeteria. They had a dumpster out there by the cafeteria, and I'm pretty sure that's what they were going over there for. And they would also check my trash can, and I would come out to my car, and the mirror on my truck would be pushed out. And and this was happening a lot because there wasn't a whole lot of space between my two cars. So I came out there one day and pushed the mirror back, and there was just this, and it was a big truck mirror, and the hand didn't even fit on it, this muddy handprint that was on the mirror. So I finally figured out, wow, these things are coming into town and killing pets, raiding trash. So I kind of nicknamed those the urban foots. And I'm guessing that this is happening in small towns all over the U.S. All the deer, the raccoons, all of the prey species, they're in town. There's mountain lions. In fact, a couple of months ago, a mountain lion killed a deer in the vacant lot next door to me. So, why wouldn't the apex predator be there also? But they're very quiet. They won't respond to yells or anything like that. It's like they're super stealthy. You don't ever hear them screaming, howling, or doing anything, in or near town. They're very quiet.
David's experiences showed him that these creatures weren't limited to remote areas or super heavy cover. They were using ravines, creek beds, and green belts the same way other wildlife does. And the closer they came to people, the more careful David became about how he interacted with them. Those encounters also reinforced something he'd been learning for years. These animals react strongly to technology, cameras, electronics, anything out of the ordinary to them. They notice it immediately. That led David to rethink how he documented what he was finding, and eventually to develop a completely different approach to capturing evidence.
Keep your technology away from them. There's been a lot of shows and stuff over the years, and it's just my personal opinion, but you get too much technology out there, you're not going to find anything. Now, I did develop a game cam that I put together probably 20 years ago. Because I always wondered, with all the game cameras out there, why aren't there more pictures? So I started experimenting with game cameras. And one thing I found out pretty quick is that the animals know it's there. They're looking at it, they're sniffing it. They know it's there. It must be giving off some kind of electrical impulse, I don't know, that they can detect. So I guess invented a game camera that doesn't use any electronics, to trigger it. And another thing, these game cameras, you'll never know the depth of field. You don't know any of that stuff. So I wanted to have something that used multiple cameras, that had a triggering setup, and I would usually put it on a trail at a pinch point. And where the subject is going to be, so you can set up your cameras on each side of it, so that you get a front and back, and set it the perfect distance from there. And I was also working on it, but I didn't finish it. When this thing would go off, it would also start an audio. But the one problem I had with it is, of course, when it was triggered, it would flash. So, but you get a totally candid shot. And I had my camera boxes destroyed, taken. Now I would love to set up some new cameras, and at that point I was using 35 millimeter because the digital stuff was just too slow. But the 35 millimeter, boom, it flashes. But with the technology they have now, plus one that would actually send the picture immediately to you, then you don't have to worry about your cameras getting torn up. But I would go to great lengths to hide the cameras, hide everything. I mean, you could go into one of these places where I had it set up, you can't see anything.
As David refined his methods, he came to believe that getting close to these animals required more patience and less intrusion than most people realize. But the more time he spent in the field, the more he began questioning something else. Why so much of this information remained outside the public eye? David wasn't alone in wondering about it. Over the years, he'd spoken with people who claimed to know far more than they could say openly, and that led him to a larger, unsettled question. If these creatures are out there, and so many people have encountered them, why hasn't there been official acknowledgement? That's where the next chapter of our story turns.
But I definitely think that the government knows about these creatures and has known for a very long time and has bodies and all of that. I mean, look what that spotted owl did up in Oregon to the logging industry. I mean, that's one thing, but if you go to these state and national parks, of course they used to have brochures, now you go online, but they will list the indigenous wildlife that's there. Stay away from it, this or that. If they acknowledge the hairy man, they're going to have to list it in the brochure. And, would a family with kids, would they still want to go to the parks, or would they take them to Disney World instead? They don't want to acknowledge these things. But I mean, I've heard from some reliable people, they absolutely know.
Whether anyone chooses to acknowledge them or not, David's experiences point to something larger than a single mystery. They point to the reality that North America still holds pockets of land wild enough to hide entire species. If that's true, then the question becomes less about proof and more about responsibility. Across the continent, the last strongholds of wilderness are shrinking. Habitat is pressured on all sides by land development, habitat fragmentation, and declining biodiversity. And every animal that depends on those places, from songbirds to apex predators, is tied to the same simple truth. If the land goes, so do they. That belief sits at the heart of the North American model of wildlife conservation. Wildlife belongs to all of us. Wild places must be protected, and every species depends on healthy habitat to survive. If a creature like the Sasquatch truly exists, it's a measure of how critical it is to protect what remains. These forested corridors, river bottoms, and forgotten stretches of public land aren't just backdrops for stories. They're lifelines for entire ecosystems. In the end, David's journey isn't just about Bigfoot encounters. It's about recognizing that the unknown still lives alongside us, quietly navigating the margins of civilization while we decide what kind of world we want to leave behind. And whether someone believes in Bigfoot or not, the message remains the same. Respect the land, protect the habitat, support the wildlife that depends on it. Because once a wild place is gone, it's gone forever.